So we talked about ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Those three work together. So if you think about a bucket being filled with water and how big the tap is or how big the hose is. So the diameter of the hose is like the aperture, right? So we have a small garden hose or we have a fire hose. Which one's going to fill the bucket faster? The fire hose will fill the bucket faster. So that's like your f2.8 or f3.5, the wider aperture. And how long you leave that tap on is like the shutter speed. So if you have a large hole for the light to come through, then you don't need to leave the shutter open as long in order to get an exposure. You can have a wide aperture and a very fast shutter speed. You could also take an image in the same situation with a smaller aperture and then a longer exposure. So in other words, you would leave the hose running longer if it's a small diameter than if you had a fire hose, you would leave it on a lot shorter to fill that same bucket. Okay? So aperture and shutter speed are always working in relationship to each other. Add the third part of the ISO, and that's the sensitivity to light. So that's the thing you want to decide first. When you look at your lighting situation, you know, okay, bright day, I'm going to use probably a 100 ISO. So make that decision first. And then you decide about your aperture and your shutter speed. We'll talk about the pluses and minuses of different apertures and shutter speeds later, but keep in mind those three things work together: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So if you have a situation that's, you know, a daylight situation, bright sunny day, choose your 100 ISO, and then you should have some flexibility in terms of your aperture and your shutter speed. You could go with a 3.5 aperture, and then your shutter speed might be at 1/200th of a second, for example. You might decide you want to make your aperture smaller, which will increase your depth of field, which we'll talk about more later, and then you would need to have your shutter speed be slower. In your textbook, the photography textbook, you can see some really good information about this in the section on aperture and shutter speed.